Today, this is an introduction to Italian wine. So we're going to talk about uh, Italian wine regions, a little bit about Italian wine law, common terms in Italian wine, and we'll go a little deeper into the regions. But it's just a survey because there are 19 wine regions, and we could talk an hour about Tuscany alone, if not more than that. Same thing for Piedmont. This is just going to be running over, and I'll give you a little bit of history. I'll try to keep within an hour period. I'll do my best on that. Okay. Well, let's start. The first thing I want to go over is some Italian wine law. So this goes from the bottom to the top of the food chain. At the very bottom is Vino di Zavola. I think it's D, not Da. This is the uncorrected sheet, and I don't know how it got out because I updated it to current law. This is just like it says, a simple table wine, often non-vintage. In fact, for a long time, you could not put a vintage on it. And it's pretty loosey-goosey. If you're in the Barolo zone and you want to produce, let's say, Zinfandel, for some crazy reason, you could do it, but it would probably be a Vino di Zavola, which you're not going to get a lot of money for the marketplace. It's a very simple wine. In fact, I'm not even sure we see much, if any, Vino di Zavola in the United States. A lot of it just stays out there. You know, you walk into a bar and you'll ask for a glass of wine. Sometimes they'll pour it from a tap, which in Italian is sfuso. And that will often be like just a simple table wine. It'll cost €1 for a Coke bottle, a 2-liter Coke bottle of it, you know. Indicazione geografica tipica, which has been changed to Indicazione geografica protetta, based on a relatively recent European wine law that from the EEC that a lot of people are don't respect very well. Let's put it that way. Or IGT. This was a type of designation. It's not an appellation. A type of designation that would allow the wines, historically, they were for Super Tuscans. So originally, Super Tuscans would have been a Vino di Zavola, something very simple. There was no category for them. And then they tried something called the predicate system, which was kind of harebrained. It did not work at all. And finally, they came up with Indicazione geografica tipica, which all that means is this is a wine made from grapes that are kind of typical here in this region, Toscana or whatever. And it's not subject to stricter rules of an appellation. So let's stop. Now we're going to enter the appellation zone. What is an appellation? An appellation is a set of rules that govern how you grow grapes for the wine and how you make the wine. And if you want to use the appellation of, let's say, I'm trying to think of something, Cortona, for example, a zone in Tuscany, that's a DOC. If you want to use that, well, you got to adhere to the rules for that. And you can't just make the wine any way you want. So a good example of how strict it could be, I'll have to borrow from France. In the Côte d'Aron appellations, the wine laws stipulate that Grenache vines must be engobelé or bush vine, untrained. And you can't train Grenache, but you can do that with Syrah, you know, a Guillot or double Guillot or other training system for Syrah, but you cannot do it for Grenache. So it's like that in Italy for some wines, and that's very strict. It tells you what grapes you can grow. It tells you what your maximum yields can be, what your minimum vine densities can be. So it encompasses a lot. An appellation in the winery says whether you can add, whether you can chaptalize. That's adding sugar to the fermenting must to increase the alcohol. Usually it's done, it's a French term because it was invented by the French almost 300 years ago. It was done when it was a cool vintage and they didn't get enough alcohol to meet the appellation requirements. So the appellation says, hey, look, if you're going to produce, let's say a Chianti, your minimum potential alcohol at time of harvest must be, I'll just pick out a number because I don't have it in mind. Let's say 11% or 10.5%. Well, if you got a cool wet vintage, it might not be possible to get that ripeness. So you would chaptalize or add sugar to the fermenting must. Sugar is converted into alcohol through the process of fermentation, alcoholic fermentation. So, and that's legal in some appellations. It lets you know basically whether you could use a screw cap or not even. It'll say whether you can acidify the wine. If it's a very hot year and your acidities are low, you know, whether you can add tartaric acid, for example, to increase the acidity of the wine. That's pretty heavy manipulation. And a lot of appellations don't allow that. So the most common type of appellation in Italy, it's called the Denominazione d'Origine Controllata, or DOC. Now they call it DOP, Denominazione d'Origine Protetta, protected appellation. It's kind of ridiculous because we're just substituting the word protetta for controllata, protected for controlled. Actually, all the other rules are the same. So it's kind of silly. So DOCs are the most common. There's a number on the bottom of this sheet. It says there are over 315 DOCs, and that's not true. There are 332 right now. And this that number is current, 332. And the wine has to be tasted every year. So it's kind of, what have you done for me lately? They can't get away with sitting on their past laurels. Then the final highest level of appellation right now is called the Denominazione d'Origine Controllata e Garantita. There's always a tasting part of that. We call it DOCG. There's really no room for this in the European rules, but guess what? The Italians are doing what they want to do. And they've increased it. So see on the sheet there, it says there are only 36 DOCGs. And this was, I think, 10 years ago. There are now 76, 40 more than double, 76 DOCGs. And usually you see it, I say it says granted to historically important zones. Well, someone threw that out the window. And like I said, they're handing them out. It's crazy. So every time there's a new zone, when you turn around, it's kind of hard to keep track. There's a handout you should have received with a list of DOCGs, and that it's current. So that is all 76 DOCGs on it. So when I say historically important, DOCGs that are common are all Chianti is DOCG, not just Chianti Classico, but all the zones, Chianti, Chianti Superiore, Chianti Colli Montespertoli, Chianti Colli Senesi, Chianti Classico, Chianti Rufina. Those are all DOCG Chiantis. Everything that says Chianti on it is a DOCG, even if it's $10 on the shelf. Then other DOCGs are Brunello, Barolo, Barbaresco, Amarone is a recent DOCG. over the protests of Amarone producers, I might add. So you get the sense of the importance of a DOCG. It should mean something, and it doesn't make sense to downgrade it when you have something like Albano di Romagna, for example, or Vernaccia di San Gimignano. Those are both white DOCGs that these are not great wines. Sorry, Italy, but there are many other great white wines in Italy. Those two aren't yet, they're DOCGs. Okay. Do you have a good sense? You can raise your hand if you have some understanding. Ask me a question if you don't understand what I've explained, because this is really important.
I have a quick question, and that is, what are the higher restrictions between DOCG and the DOC?
It can be with regard to maximum yields, could be lower. There could be longer aging requirements. For example, Barolo's 2 years in barrel, Barbaresco's 1 year. Bernello is 24 months in barrel plus 6 months in bottle, but it must be aged a total of 42 months. So it's going to spend even more time in barrel and bottle than the minimum. Because even that only adds up to 34 months, and 42 is the minimum before you can release it. Does that help? So there are just a little stricter rules with regard to yield and aging and so forth. Minimum potential alcohol is probably higher too.
So Arnie, I have a question. There's no general relation between the Vino di Zavola as you go up the chain, so to speak. It doesn't get more expensive, or the advantage of having it.
It can. I mean, there's $10 Chianti, which is DOCG. There's Vernaccia di San Gimignano is inexpensive as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean the wine's going to be more expensive. In terms of the food chain, by that I'm referring to the fact of rules and control. Because for Vino di Zavola, it's usually whatever you want to do. You know, you want to grow an American grape called a terrible American grape called muscadine, or you want to bring some South African crazy grape and you've got some weird ideas about making wine, well, you can do it. Just call it a table wine. You don't want, I have a lot of restrictions on you, but you respect the native grapes or grapes that are successful in that area, you go for an IGT. Get more money on the shelf as well in general. DOCs, that's where you start getting in a prestige. And the DOCs, the DOCGs account for a good chunk, if not most, of Italian wine production. So a lot of it's done there. But like I said, it doesn't always correspond to price. Okay, shall I move on? Any more questions? It's a good time to ask. All right, let's go to the top of the, yeah.
Most of the DOCGs in the more famous wine areas, as opposed to Aosta or Sicily or Le Marche.
Yeah, right now there's only one DOCG in Sicily, Ceresolo di Vittoria, which is pretty strange. Because I think that Etna Rossa could be a DOCG. It's a distinguished wine. And it might deserve promotion to DOCG, but there's only one on the entire island of Sicily. That's crazy.
Why would excuse me, Arnie, but why would a producer not want to? You were talking about Amarone producers didn't want to upgrade, in quotation marks.
They don't look at it as an upgrade. They just look at it as more intrusion by the government.
Yeah.
And while that doesn't mean they're adverse to quality, but as you know, you have bureaucrats often without consulting any people in the wine biz who know better, will put certain restrictions on that don't make any sense, or that are a real pain in the neck to adhere to. It helps if you've ever seen the paperwork for this. And you think about the regular Italian wine grower, you know, the guy that's working, he's like the French vigneron. He's got coveralls on. He works in the vineyard, then he works in the wineries, making the wine and growing the grapes. He doesn't have teams of people, you know, helping him out. Occasionally he might, or have relatives or his kids or his wife help out, but it's a small operation. And yet, if he's making an appellation wine, the paperwork is just, to me, I would be overwhelmed. It can be crazy, especially France is even worse. And God forbid you want to get certified for organic wine. That's a whole thing in and of itself. That's very, very difficult to get and very difficult to fill out the paperwork for. I mean, it's just crazy. Okay, let's go to some Italian wine label terms. And is everyone okay on appellations and DOCs and DOCGs and so forth? I put this, this is how I came up with these terms. It is the fact that these are the terms that people ask most often about. Sometimes, if you see at the very bottom, it says Tenuta, which is a wine estate. Sometimes I'll have someone actually come up to me in a shop and go, hey, Arnie, I had a wine the other week. It was fantastic. It was called Tenuta. That's like saying, I had a wine last week that was great. It was from a winery. So you have to know that that's a term, not a name of a wine. So just going down the list here, which is, I regret, not in alphabetical order. My later ones are. This was accidentally sent because, like I said, it's out of date. Fattoria is the large wine estate. Usually, if you see that, it's not a small deal. It's not a husband and wife or two-person operation. It's usually got teams of people working there. Cascina can be very small. A cantina is often a code word for a co-op. So most cantinas, like a cantina sociale, would be a co-op for sure. Brico or Brick, I put that on because I remember up on Queen Anne, we had a wonderful wine bar called Brico della Regina d'Anna, which no longer is here. And so I was inspired to put it on the list here. It's a hilltop vineyard. A very large estate is an Azienda Agricola, which produces wines from at least half of its estate. So it sources at least half. A lot of people now are going to 100% estate wines, but there's no legal term for that. And they don't necessarily, they might be too small, or they might not want to use the term Azienda Agricola. They can use other terms like making it a Tenuta, for example. It's a kind of generic term. A podere is a small farm holding. Typically you have a sharecropper. So actually before land reform in Italy, and even now in France, for example, there are people farming vineyards, making wine, and it's a sharecropping arrangement. They make it from someone else's vines, and they provide the owner of the vines of the land with an allotment of wine from the harvest. So kind of a sharecropper arrangement that's still in existence. Poggio, like I think of Poggio Scaletti, which is an absolutely fantastic estate. It's a Chianti Classico estate, but they're really known for their wine called Il Carboneone, which is from 110-year-old vines up on a hill on a lot of volcanic soil. That's really amazing. That's why it's called Il Carboneone, because of the soil. And it's a world-leading type of Super Tuscan. It's owned by the Fioris, Vittorio Fiori and a Signori. And that's a typical small estate. In fact, the winery is so small, and I know I'm not the tiniest person in the world, but I mean, I really had to squeeze between tanks and whatnot to get through the winery. I mean, it's crazy how tiny it is. And it's on a hill. So it's actually a Poggio. I want to add one that's not on this list. It's on the other list I sent called Reserva. That's a legal term. You know, in the States, you can put reserve on anything you want. In Washington State, I remember we had something like Columbia Crest Grand Estates Reserve. Well, there was no Grand Estates, and Reserve was just a label. They just said $8.99 on the shelf. Come on, and so that's a meaningless term. In France, you could put reserve on anything you want, right? But in Italy and Spain, reserve or reserva is a legal term. And usually it requires an extra year of aging in wood, maybe a slightly higher alcohol content at time of harvest. They even look at what's called dry extract. So dry extract is the solids in the wine. You take the wine, you put the liquid in a Petri dish, you put a flame underneath, what evaporates is the liquid, you're left with solids, and you weigh that, and you have a weight in grams per liter. And so that's called dry extract, and it tells you about the concentration of the wine. So how intense it can be or not. And for example, Chianti Classico Reserva, and I'm pulling this out of my hat here, but the requirements for dry extract are like 25 grams per liter. That's true. Then you have the new appellation, which I think is nonsense. Sorry, I'm opinionated, called Gran Selezione, which starts basically with the 09 or 10 vintage. Why do they do this? Well, the only good thing about Gran Selezione is it's from estate vineyards, but it's got ridiculous aging requirements and dry extract differences. And I got to tell you, you can be a very good, experienced taster, be able to taste blind and nail things, but you'd never be able to taste this. The difference between Gran Selezione and Reserva in dry extract is 1 gram per liter, from 25 grams per liter to 26 grams per liter. Those are minimums. It's got to be aged instead of 24 months in oak for Reserva, 30 months in oak for Gran Selezione. Come on, do you really think you'll be able to tell the difference between 1 gram of dry extract difference and maybe 6 more months in barrel? And the answer is no. So forget Gran Selezione, it's usually overpriced. And that doorbell was probably a bunch of Italian winemakers. It's overpriced, and you get a very similar wine that's Reservas. Okay, Superiore. This is not as simple as you might think, because yes, there's usually a demand for, this is higher potential alcohol time of harvest, which is a measure, but you're measuring is must weight. And that tells you the sugars and the juice, the specific gravity of it. And the higher the specific gravity or the higher the must weight, the more alcohol it will make if you ferment it dry. So they are asking for a 0.5% higher generally. Yeah, sometimes they'll add a oak aging requirement or some kind of aging requirement for Superiore. And sometimes it can be a sub-region or sub-zone within a larger appellation. So it can be geographic as well. I know it's kind of confusing, but are you surprised that's Italian wine?
Arnie, I have a question.
Yeah.
What is dry extract?
I was just saying it's when you, pardon me, I'm getting my water. When you you put a pour wine into a Petri dish, you put it over a flame, and all the liquid evaporates because of the flame. You're left with solid matter in the Petri jar, Petri dish. And that solid matter is the dry extract. You measure it in terms of grams per liter. And Tenuta, like we said, is just a term for wine estate. Any questions on these? Any other questions? Does this help, by the way, set the groundwork? Because we're going to use these terms. All right. I'm going to give you a few thousand years of history in a couple of minutes. So hold on, put your seatbelts on. You know, unlike a lot of other places, I mean, Italy itself has grown up with wine, if you will. We go from the Etruscan age on, there was always wine. And it was probably brought to Italy from the East, from Greece and so forth, through transhumanists, the travels of sojourners along usually waterways. They made and brought with them wine culture. The Greeks certainly democratized wine for their society. And when they colonized the southern part of Italy, Il Mezzogiorno in Italian, or Magna Graecia in Greek, when they colonized those areas, what did they do? They planted vines. In fact, they called Italy Onetria, land of the vine. The Romans, it's a shame I got to keep moving so fast. We went from Greeks and get whiplash. We're going to Roman times now. The Romans took wine to a whole other level than the Greeks. They even had, if you will, sommeliers that they would call in Latin hostares. They were even wine critics, so they would grade wine. They'd say it, talk about its colors of album, fulvum, album white, of course, fulvum yellow. Alveolum would be like a rosé. Purpureum and sanguinum would be a dark red. They would opine about the quality of the wine. Maybe if they liked a big, rich red, they'd call it consistens, solidum e forte. And if they thought it was pretty bad, which a lot of wine was, by the way, by our standards, they would call it sordidum e vile. And I don't think that requires a lot of translation. But so they often gave opinions about various wines. They had a crew system in place. So a lot of wealthy Romans journeyed to Campania and established wine estates. That was the thing to do. We find its correspondent today in Washington State, where a lot of techies who made a ton of money decided to open up their own wineries here and there, like in Walla Walla and Yakima Valley and whatnot. The same thing in Rome. And in fact, there were lots of guides for planting grapes. Columella, who was a Roman of Spanish origin, wrote in Re Ruralis. He went down and specified what you needed to build a wine estate, how many slaves you'd need, for example, to work it, ways to make the wine. Other people Martial came up with recipes for wine, including medicinal purposes for wine that by our standards, they were foul, but they worked in Roman times. Don't forget, wine is a disinfectant. If you're unsure about your water quality, well, add some wine to it. And this is what they often did, especially when they were giving water to the kids. They'd often put a little bit of wine in there, which not only sanitized it, but the kids were pretty mellow. They wouldn't get as excited. So this is a long history. And when we talk about the idea of something like food and wine pairing, this is something that seems a little odd to Italians and French and Spanish. They grew up with the wine from their local area. And Italy is one of the only countries, the only country I know of where every part of the country is a wine region. Every part, every major region. And they grew up with the local food and the local wine. And over time, they worked together really well. They may have fine-tuned it a bit over the centuries. But it's natural for them to have their local wine with the local food. It's a good rule of wine and food pairing. If you're not sure what you got, try to get the local cuisine with the local wine. Usually it'll be a great match. So they didn't have connoisseurship. During the next big age in Italian wine were the formation of the monastic orders, and what they did was they helped revive all the old knowledge about wine from Roman times. They preserved it. They often, it was in Latin. And as you know, with Dante, he was the first to write in the Italian language. And I think that spurred a lot of changes in the church too. They would publish certain things about winemaking and so forth in vernacular Italian rather than Latin or even Greek. So the church played a huge role in preserving and promulgating viticulture throughout Italy, and bringing along the idea of terroir and quality in wines. After the Middle Ages and the Enlightenment, we had Cosimo Medici III in 1716 was the first to delimit a wine region, the Chianti region, in 1716. It was the very first. But there weren't any hard and fast rules for that. We continue through the big changes in Italian wine probably occurred starting in the 1950s and 60s, especially with land reform, which is very important to the South. The adoption of the French appellation rules to Italy. Italy's system started in 1981, I believe, was the first DOCG. But their whole DOC system, which began in the 1960s, really was adopted from the French system, which began in 1936. I mean, the current one that we have today. Pardon me. So it's been a dynamic adventure. Things have changed a lot. What you could do, let's say in Chianti, has evolved to meet what the de facto ways that people are making wine in Chianti. They used to be forced to have 20% white grapes in there, red Chianti. No longer. They weren't allowed to have anything but Sangiovese, Canaiolo, Colorino, and so forth in their wines. Now you can do what they've always done. They just legalized it, that's all. And you can have either 100% Sangiovese, which you couldn't have before. You can add Merlot if you want. Cabernet Sauvignon is legal in Chianti, but I think it's you got to have a minimum of 75% Sangiovese in there. And you can't have more than 10%, I believe, of either Merlot or Cabernet Sauvignon. But these would have been unheard of 20 years ago or so, 30 years ago. And now you can pretty much see how it's adapted to the times, because Italians would ignore the rules and just do what they wanted to do and still claim the appellation. And it was almost futile to try to prosecute them in any way. So they just changed the appellation rules. Okay, you win. You're allowed to add Cabernet if you want. You're allowed to add Merlot if you want to Chianti Classico. Okay, so you have an idea what's going on, where we were, where we are now. Very briefly, let's take a look at the map. So 19 wine regions. This is a really easy to read map. Now, someone was asking before about appellations within a region. So Piedmont is a region. You could see it in the upper left-hand corner. It's a region, but within Piedmont, you have Barolo and Barbaresco, Roero Hills, Gattinara in the north, so and Gavi in the southeast. So those are wine regions, sub-regions rather. Appellations is really what they are within the big wine region of Piedmont. Same thing in Tuscany, Brunello, Chianti, Chianti Classico is closer between Florence and Siena. Those appellations, those are appellations within the region of Tuscany. Okay. Now I divide Italy into north, central, and southern. And what I'll tell you how I do it, because everyone's got a different opinion. In the north, I put Valle d'Aosta, Piedmont, Lombardia, the Veneto, Trentino Alto Adige, and Friuli Venezia Giulia, and the Veneto. So those are what I consider northern Italy. And I put Emilia Romagna and Liguria starting in the center. Why do I do that? Well, if you look at the top of Emilia Romagna, which is a very wide area that nearly goes from one coast to the other, it's separated from the Veneto and parts of Lombardia by the Po River. And the grapes are a little different there. And in Emilia Romagna, you have the beginning of the Apennine, the spine that runs down the center of the foot of Italy. And so that's a very important area that marks what I think is central Italy. The main grapes are Sangiovese, for example, you find in all of these, or the Montepulciano grape in the Marca. Even in Liguria, you have things like, well, Vermentino is very important there, but you do have plantings of Vermentino, which is a central Italian grape variety. There's one other red grape there that Ciligiolo, which is really a more of a Tuscan variety, and is, by the way, a parent of Sangiovese. So that's why I put those in the center. And then the south, Sardinia, you could put either way. I tend to put it in the center because there's so many, along with Lazio, that's the area around Rome and Umbria. But I put Abruzzo, Molise, Campania, Puglia, Basilicata, Calabria, Sicily. Those are the south. Why did I do that? Why is Abruzzo in the south and not the center? It has to do a lot with the grapes. There's more Montepulciano grape there. There's a fair amount of Sangiovese, but Montepulciano grape is king. And you don't find it in the only area that, other than Abruzzo, that's got Montepulciano in any quantity is in the Marca, just north of it. But I think Abruzzo and Molise used to be one area, and they just recently split them apart. And you could put Abruzzo in the center, I guess. There's maybe a little bit of Aglianico in the south, like there is in Molise, which to me makes it a southern Italian area. Aglianico, a very important red grape in the south. Found a lot in Campania and Basilicata. And Puglia, well, that's obviously the heel of the boot. That's no way that's anything but southern Italy, along with Calabria and Sicily. So it's got its own set of grapes. And Puglia right now is a hotspot for investors who want to start new wineries and plant new vineyards. You can grow high quality grapes there. It's inexpensive. So Antinori, a lot of money from wineries in the north have gone down to Puglia, where they have some big investments. In Calabria, its main grape is red and it's called Galliopo. Sicily, like I said, it's got one DOCG, Terrazolo di Vittoria, which is a blend of Nero d'Avola and Frappato. But I think Etna Rosso should be elevated because the wines are really distinguished. It's historic. It meets those requirements. It's mostly shoot, I have it over here. Nerello Mascalese is the main grape, along with Nerello Cappuccio and Sicily. And I think that's a good opportunity to become a DOCG there. Sardinia, this island has some Tony resorts. Importantly, in the north, they've got great cork forests. Gaia sources his cork only from Sardinia, some of the best cork in the world. Grenache is a very important grape there. It's called Canonel locally, and it's a Spanish grape. And the reason you have Spanish grapes there, not just Grenache, but Graciano, for example, is an important grape, is in Sardinia, is because it was part of the Kingdom of Naples, which was ruled by the Spanish in the 17th and 18th century. So a very strategically important area, a lot of Spanish influence on the island, a lot of shepherds there. So it's very rustic in the center and west part of Sardinia. There we go. So any questions before we start talking about these in any detail? Did everyone receive a sheet that major or main Italian grape varieties and a listing of grape varieties? I hope you have, because I'm not gonna, that sheet's got a lot of good basic detail on some of these grapes. And I'm not gonna go into that a lot here, mostly because of time requirements. Yeah, I mean, I had to cull down this list just for main Italian varietals to 2 or 3 pages. And I know that when I teach in-depth Italy, like we'll do the North only, I mean, even for that, I've got 2 or 3 sheets of grape varieties for each region. So doing it for all of Italy, willowing it down to 2 pages or so is very tough. There is no other country with such a wealth of native grape varieties as Italy, nobody. It's got the highest proportion of native or local grapes that are important in winemaking than any other country as well. Nobody comes close. Hundreds and hundreds of varietals. I think there are maybe 400 varieties that are authorized for appellation wine. So amazing. And one thing that you'll always be learning, and I'm always learning, are new grape varieties that keep coming to light, you know. For example, in Puglia, I'm a big fan of a grape called Susamagnello. You know, who's ever heard of that, right? But it's indigenous to Puglia, and it makes a pretty darn good wine. Same thing for the marca. They've got Lacrima Moro d'Alba, a grape hardly anyone's heard of, that makes some terrific red wine. In Lazio, Cesanese, especially Cesanese del Piglio, which is a DOCG, usually under $20, a terrific wine. Corte de Papi makes a terrific Cesanese del Piglio.
So you talked about the grapes, the wines in Tuscany changing over the last 50 years to allow something other than Sangiovese and specific percentages of things. Did that happen because of the experimentations with Super Tuscans in the 50s, 60s? Is that what
Oh.
happened? People actually,
No, it just what it did was it codified practice. It codified practice.
so people were already doing that.
People were doing it. And by the way, that's a good definition of tradition. Tradition, in a way, is an experiment that worked. Think about that. And just like that, it's what people have been doing because it worked. They made this wine this way for a while, and it was the responsibility to codify that. Originally, these appellations, one of the imperatives that they had when they set out to define the appellations was take a look at what people were doing currently and somehow codify that into a set of rules. That's how this all came about anyway. And what people were doing changed, of course, over time, as it should. And so a lot of people, like I said, in Chianti, and they were absolutely ignoring all those rules, yet still putting the Chianti label on it. And it was just the consortio. Every appellation has a consortio that administers the rules, and usually it's governed by the winemakers themselves. They're elected to it. For example, Count Chisano, for a while, was president of the consortio for Bernello, and until the big Bernello scandal in 2003 when he had to step down. But it's all growers or producers that are along with bureaucrats that are on the consortio. So they go up to the Ministry of Agriculture. In the end, its group decides what the appellation rules will finally be and okays them. The consortio is at the local level. Okay. Let's talk about some of these main regions. We're going to keep this up for a bit. So I told you how I divided the country up into north, center, and south. I think it's helpful because it's just so much to be able to put your arms around it. So because of time, we all, we're coming up on, we're almost an hour. What I want to do is focus instead on some of the main wines from these regions, the most important appellations. So for Piedmont, we'll start there. Val d'Aosta is very small. The wines are not only obscure, but sometimes a bit eccentric. Sorry to condemn everybody in Val d'Aosta. It's also, they speak and use French a lot there too, Val d'Aosta, because this was all Duchy of Savoy back in the day. Piedmont, fascinating because wine and history go hand in hand here in a very unusual way. Culturally, there's similarities to Burgundy, as you may have heard before, but what's the word I want to use? The reunification of Italy, or the unification of Italy, which is called the Risorgimento, occurred in the 1860s. And one of the main movers and shakers was a guy named Count Camille Cavour, who, by the way, didn't even know Italian. He had to learn it when he was being involved in the Risorgimento. But he's my kind of politician. And I say that because he actually hired, at his expense, out of his pocketbook, some French enologists to come up and help the local winemakers make better wine. So Barolo, as we know it today in Barbaresco, some of it, we owe a debt of gratitude to Count Cavour, because those French enologists taught the locals, better techniques for making better wine. Barolo, for example, is 100% Nebbiolo. It's usually harvested late. The old style of Nebbiolo, which wasn't bad, it was just not a very complex big wine. It was more fruity. There weren't a lot of tannins. And it's quite different from what we have today, when Barolo, especially from the Serralunga Valley, can be, tight as an iron forge. It's just needs a lot of age on it to open up. Usually there are some fierce tannins with the Nebbiolo grape when it comes to Barolo and Barbaresco. So those are two areas. Barolo's southwest of Barbaresco. They're the province of Cuneo. Barolo is basically two valleys that are divided by a highway. So the Serralunga in the east and the Valley of Barolo in the west side. There are different soil types, and the Valley of Barolo, where you have things like Brunate, and which is a crew of Barolo, and Canubi, which is some of my favorite. The soils are a third of clay, limestone, and sand. And the sand is really cool. When you see it, it's an amazing taupe color. It's gorgeous. And that's usually the surface soil. And beneath it is clay and limestone. And those wines have a little more softness to them. They're a little more approachable, younger, and can be quite enjoyable. And they'll age also. Yeah, but in the Serralunga, you have these Helvetian soils that have more irony content and more limestone and sandstone. And those wines can require a lot more time before they become enjoyable. Especially in Monforte and Blucia Soprano, those areas are just tighter in the drum, and they need a fair amount of time to open up. So the difference between Barolo and Barbaresco is geographically, they're not very close. They're very close to each other, but the soil types are different. They're both run by the Toronto River, but Barbaresco is much closer to the river. The river exerts an influence on the climate. That's very important, especially in Barbaresco, and makes a little softer wine. And the aging requirement is 1 year in Barbaresco and 2 years in Barolo, but they're both 100% Nebbiolo, no other grapes allowed. So what I'm gonna cover then, we'll talk about the Veneto and Tuscany, just those three, because those are the most important regions left. So the Veneto, you all know for Amarone and Valpolicella, and Rapasso, which is kind of like a junior Amarone. Amarone is not the name of a grape. It's the name of a wine. And Amarone is made from, they're very clever in the Veneto. So they make Amarone, Valpolicella, Rapasso, and kind of a not too sweet dessert wine, all from the same grapes. So Corvina, it's the most important one, usually around 70%. Rondinella, Molinara is on its way out. Corvinone is on its way in. It's unrelated to Corvina, even though they sound similar. They're completely unrelated. And there's even some Osaleta allowed and grandfathered in some areas. So basically, Valpolicella is very light. It's got those same grapes, but they can also come from a valley area by the Po River. The Veneto is kind of like a wine engine of Italy. It's kind of like California's Central Valley because it's very fertile in the Po River Valley. And unfortunately, that the increase in yield and harvest means a little lesser quality and lesser concentration. So some of the plonk that you find in the supermarket, like Bola Valpolicella or Suave Bola, that's all harvested from container truckloads of grapes that are farmed with very high yields in the Po Valley. When you see, the best part of it is called Classico, and that means the original delimited zone. That's all. So the original delimited zone for both the Suave and Valpolicella, and therefore Amarone, were mostly volcanic hillsides. And over the years, they've expanded it to include these huge areas along the Po Valley. So when you see Classico, you're a little better off. You're going to get a better wine. So Valpolicello is those grapes. Ripasso, well, let's go to Amarone and then Ripasso. Amarone, but it's harvested usually by hand. Most of it, the best is the Classico region. It's usually free run juice or must. They don't use much pressed juice in the best Amarones. When you harvest the grapes in September, you dry them. Usually these days it's in a modern warehouse. In the old days it was on straw. But you dry them in this air controlled environment to avoid mildew and rot. And then you crush the grapes in January. So they're dried. That process in Italian is called appassimento, and the type of wines from it are called passito. A lot of dessert wines are passito wines. Oh my God, some water. Let's go to Tuscany, because there's so many regions that are important, but the two we'll talk about are Chianti and Brunello. So we explained earlier about Chianti that all of it is DOCG. In fact, you can still find those flasks, with the straw, which in Italian is called, those round flasks with the straw. Those are called the fiasco, and appropriately named. And it's a light table wine, spaghetti red that you often see on those cheap vinyl tablecloths, checkered white and red. It can't age. Usually it's very inexpensive, and still, because it's a Chianti, it's DOCG, even if it costs $11 for a flask. The most important regions in Chianti are Chianti Classico. That, like I also said earlier, was first delimited in 1716 by Cosimo Medici III. That's why it's called the Classico area. It's the earliest delimited zone. So it's called Classico. Then the other area that's also can be as good as Classico is Chianti Rufino, which is to the east of Florence, whereas Classico is between Florence and Siena. And like we talked about earlier as well, your grape varieties can change. A lot of producers are doing mostly Sangiovese. They're doing often 90% Sangiovese or 100% Sangiovese these days. But still people are adding Merlot to soften the wine a little bit, because Sangiovese has a fair amount of asperity to it, or can, but they're getting better with it. And it was a big study 20 years ago called Chianti 2000, put out by the Consortio di Gallo Nero, the Black Rooster consortium that on the bottle stickers. And they did a study about the best types of Sangiovese to plant in various areas. So that was a landmark study. It was very helpful to winemakers and growers, so they would plant the best type of Sangiovese and make a better wine in the end in the Classico region. And then there are other sub-regions, what they call the Colli, the hills. So Colli Senesi, Colli Pisano, Colli Aretini, and so on are all different zones. And again, they're all DOCG, but they're not as good. If I was ranking it, I'd say Classico, Rufina, and then Colli Senesi are the three top parts of the Chianti appellation in general. Brunello di Montalcino, this goes back well over about 120 years. It's made exclusively from Sangiovese Grosso. Among the first people, the pioneers, were the Biondi Santi family, and their estate is on Montalcino, but on the north side. So it's a little cooler area, of course. The south side of the hill, especially above the Abbey of Sant'Antimo, is where a lot of money is heading, and a lot of top scoring Brunello is coming from. and one of the hottest areas. On the south end, you have Castiglione dell'Abate, and this is where some amazing estates are, just on the south part of the hill overlooking the monastery. So 100% Sangiovese Grosso. We talked about this earlier as well. 42 months of aging, of which a minimum 24 months in oak and 6 months in bottle. For reservas, add an extra year of aging and 8 months in bottle. So there we go. And the big oak, types of oak that you can use, traditionally it's been Slavonian oak, which does not come from Slovenia, but comes from Croatia, just for confusing everyone in the world. So there's a forest called the Slavonian forest in Northeast Croatia, and that's where the oak is grown for Slavonian oak. And then you have French oak. Those are the two major types, and they make a big difference. So the more contemporary producers are using French, more traditional Slavonian. Very few people use the old cherry oak, cherry cask, for a bunch of reasons. It's very difficult to work with. It doesn't have the porosity that oak has, which is, I think, very important for the aging of wine. So those are your big areas. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to talk about all the others, but with an hour, this is a little over an hour. We've covered an awful lot of ground, from the history, from the appellation system, from the various regions, and some of the various wines that we got down to.